Welcome in. Today we're going deep into the realities of the war in Ukraine. It's a complicated situation, and the sources you've shared really show that. But what makes this stalemate so interesting is that it's not static at all. There's a huge human cost, some serious political maneuvering, and global implications that we need to dig into.
Yeah, it's really about the cost of this stalemate. We're looking at a war of attrition, basically, a conflict where each side is trying to wear the other down through losses. But Ukraine's resources, especially its manpower, are being stretched incredibly thin.
Exactly. It's like General Kimmett says in this interview we have. He uses the term bleeding out. There's no clear winner or loser right now, but Ukraine is having a harder time rebuilding its fighting force.
So then the question becomes, what are they fighting for? If neither side can achieve a traditional victory, are there deeper political and strategic objectives at play here?
Well, General Kimmett suggests that the main action is concentrated in the east, specifically the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. It seems like that's where Russia is focusing its efforts. He also points out two other areas to watch: the Kharkiv and Kursk regions.
And those areas are really interesting for different reasons. Kharkiv has been a focal point throughout the war, but then you have the Kursk region, which saw that surprising incursion by Ukrainian forces into Russia itself.
Kimmett actually calls that incursion masterful because of the surprise factor and the propaganda victory it gave Ukraine. Just imagine pushing into Russia and posing a threat, however symbolic, to Moscow.
It was definitely a bold move, but it doesn't seem to have fully achieved its goal of pulling Russian troops away from the east. In fact, one of our sources indicates that Zelensky himself estimates around 50,000 Russian troops are now in the Kursk region.
And that same source claims that Ukrainian forces have taken control of over 1,300 square kilometers and about 100 settlements within the Kursk region. So there have been some territorial gains, but at what cost?
And this is where the human impact of the war really hits you. The information about Kursk doesn't sugarcoat the reality for Ukrainian soldiers on the ground. Injuries, immense psychological stress, and the constant threat of death or capture.
It's easy to focus on the maps, the strategies, and the politics. But we can't forget about the real people fighting and dying in this war. And there's a report that was highlighted by Akhmat Special Forces Commander Abdiel Ludinov that paints an even grimmer picture.
This is where the information gets really heavy, but it's important to face it. This report claims that over 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers are missing, and about 7,000 civilians are unaccounted for. It alleges that the Ukrainian government is downplaying these casualties and resorting to forced conscription.
And not just any conscription. This report says they're targeting people with disabilities, those who oppose the war, anyone they can force into service. It even mentions political prisoners, including children, being detained for speaking out against the war or expressing sympathy for Russia.
If these allegations are true, it's an extremely serious situation. It suggests a potential human rights crisis within Ukraine, which just adds another layer of complexity to this conflict.
And this report goes on to specifically accuse the Ukrainian Security Service, the SBU, of human rights abuses. Again, these are claims that need further investigation, but they definitely raise some big concerns.
It's always important to remember that information coming out of a war zone is often contested. We're presenting you with the information from the sources, and we encourage you to think critically about it and consider the potential biases involved.
Absolutely. So we have this grinding stalemate on the ground, a potentially escalating human cost, and then you factor in the political maneuvering, which is just as fascinating.
Kimmett argues that Ukraine's goal of taking back all lost territory, including Crimea, just isn't realistic in the current situation. He also notes that Western support, while still there, is starting to waver. This is partly due to economic strain and the need for these countries to focus on their NATO obligations.
And to add to all of this, you have the newly elected U.S. President Donald Trump, who campaigned on a promise to quickly end the war. That has to be causing some anxiety in Kyiv.
Alaudinov's Telegram post even mentions that Trump's push for peace talks is generating both concern and a glimmer of hope in the Ukrainian capital. There is a lot of uncertainty about what a Trump administration will actually do to try to resolve this conflict.
So we're seeing this incredibly complex interplay of battlefield realities, human costs, and political maneuvering all happening against a backdrop of shifting global power dynamics. It's a lot to process.
And speaking of global implications, Kimmett brings up a chilling point. Ukraine's population is shrinking not just from casualties, but also through defections. He also highlights that Russia is reportedly seeking help from North Korean troops to boost its manpower. That's a development with far-reaching consequences.
And that potential involvement of North Korean troops is particularly worrying because it could expand the conflict beyond Ukraine's borders and potentially draw in other international players. It's like a ripple effect spreading outward.
This stalemate might look frozen on the surface, but underneath it's a pressure cooker of competing forces and motivations. It's a situation that requires careful thought. And that's what we're trying to do here, present you with the information and encourage you to form your own conclusions.
Absolutely. And speaking of conclusions, what aspects of this deep dive has stood out to you so far? What's resonating most strongly? Is it the sheer human cost of the stalemate, the intricate political maneuvering, or maybe the uncertainty surrounding the future of U.S. involvement? We've only scratched the surface here, and there's much more to explore.
Hold on to those thoughts because in part 2, we'll delve even deeper into the political landscape, explore the potential for peace talks, and examine the global implications of this seemingly intractable conflict. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and focus on the political game surrounding this conflict. The sources you've shared really shed light on the motivations and strategies of the key players here.
It's a real tangled web. And as we've seen, the stalemate on the ground just makes the political maneuvering off of it even more intense.
Exactly. Kimmett makes a really interesting point when he suggests that Western support for Ukraine, while still significant, is starting to show some cracks. The economic pressures and the need to balance various commitments, including NATO, are making things complicated for Western leaders.
Could you maybe break down those NATO obligations a bit? I think it would be helpful to understand why those commitments might be pulling attention away from Ukraine.
Of course, NATO operates on the idea of collective defense. So an attack on one member is an attack on all. Even though NATO isn't directly involved in the conflict with Russia, its members have to think about their own security concerns and commitments within the alliance. This means balancing support for Ukraine with making sure they're prepared to defend themselves, which can be tough both financially and logistically.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then you add in the newly elected U.S. President Donald Trump, who ran on a promise to quickly end the war. That has to be adding to the tension in Kyiv.
Absolutely. Trump's foreign policy has always been kind of unpredictable, and his past statements about the conflict haven't exactly been reassuring. Aladonov's Telegram post even mentions that Trump's push for peace talks is being met with both hope and apprehension in the Ukrainian capital.
So with all of these factors at play, what are the chances of a negotiated settlement? Is there a realistic path to peace? Or are we looking at a conflict that could drag on for years?
That's the big question, isn't it? The sources we've looked at suggest that there are some major obstacles to a negotiated solution, but there are also some glimmers of hope. It's important to remember, though, that any potential settlement isn't just about stopping the fighting. It's about creating a lasting peace that addresses the root causes of the conflict.
That's a good point. So where do we even begin to untangle this mess? Kimmett doesn't hold back when he calls Ukraine's goal of reclaiming all lost territory, including Crimea, unrealistic. He seems to be pushing for a more practical approach, one that acknowledges the situation on the ground.
I agree. And that seems to align with what some senior Ukrainian officials are saying privately, even if their public stance is different. One source mentions that behind closed doors, some officials admit that the final ceasefire lines will likely be determined by the military situation. This suggests there might be a gap between public statements and private assessments.
It does sound like there could be some room for compromise there. But even if there's a willingness to negotiate, what about Russia? Are they really interested in a peaceful solution, or are they just stalling for time?
That's where things get even more complicated. The same source that mentions peace talks also points out that there's a lot of skepticism in Kyiv about Russia's sincerity. They haven't forgotten the failed ceasefires in 2014 and 2015, which just led to more fighting. This history makes it hard to trust anything coming from Moscow.
And to make matters worse, Russian lawmakers have been suggesting that territorial concessions from Ukraine are a non-starter. That doesn't exactly sound promising for a quick and easy resolution.
It definitely doesn't. And then you have the issue of security guarantees for Ukraine going forward. Any peace agreement would have to address this in a way that satisfies both sides, which is a tall order. It's a really delicate balancing act.
One source mentions that Ukraine is looking for strong security commitments, whether through NATO membership or something similar to protect itself from future aggression. But the West is hesitant to fast-track Ukraine into NATO, which puts Kyiv in a tough spot. It's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
They are. So we have the situation where everyone seems to want peace, but the path to getting there is full of obstacles, there's a lot of distrust, and the stakes are incredibly high. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a changing global landscape, which brings us to the wider implications of this conflict.
Right. This isn't just about Ukraine and Russia. It's about the future of Europe, the balance of power between East and West, and the rules of international engagement in the 21st century. The consequences are global.
Exactly. And one of the most worrying aspects is the potential for the conflict to spread beyond Ukraine's borders. Kimmett mentions that Russia is reportedly seeking military support from North Korea, which could have a huge impact on regional stability. It could really change the game.
And the information about Kursk also touches on the possible consequences of North Korea getting involved. It warns that it could pull in other international players and further destabilize an already volatile region. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
This is where the stakes become truly global. If the conflict spills over into neighboring countries or triggers a wider confrontation between major powers, the consequences could be catastrophic. It's something that policymakers around the world are definitely thinking about with a lot of concern.
So we're looking at a conflict that's not only devastating for Ukraine, but also has the potential to reshape the global order in profound and unpredictable ways. It's a sobering thought.
It is. And one of the most disturbing aspects is the human cost of this war. We've already talked about the staggering casualties, both military and civilian, but there's another aspect that often gets overlooked, the displacement of millions of people. The human suffering is immeasurable.
Right. The war has forced millions of Ukrainians to flee their homes, seeking refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. This mass exodus has created a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions, straining resources and testing the limits of international compassion. It's a tragedy unfolding on a massive scale.
It reminds us that the true cost of war isn't just measured in military equipment or political maneuvering, but in the shattered lives of ordinary people caught in the middle. The human stories are what really matter.
As we dig deeper into these sources, it becomes clear that the ripple effects of this conflict are far-reaching and multifaceted. It's a complex tapestry of human suffering, political intrigue, and global power dynamics. And there are no easy answers.
It's overwhelming, to be honest.
It really is. And it leads to the critical question, what can be done to break the stalemate, ease the suffering, and prevent further escalation? Are there any viable options for a peaceful resolution? Or are we destined to witness a prolonged and bloody conflict that will leave a permanent scar on the world? We'll explore these questions and more in the final part of our deep dive. I think one thing that's become really clear throughout this whole discussion is that there are no easy answers here.
Yeah.
The sources paint a pretty sobering picture of a conflict that's dug in deep with no clear way out.
Yeah, it's true. We've talked about the military stalemate, the humanitarian crisis, the geopolitical maneuvering. It all points to a war that could go on for years. But even with this bleak outlook, are there any signs of hope? Any potential paths to peace that we might be missing?
I think it's important to stay optimistic, to be open to possibilities even when they seem small. And the sources do hint at some ways to de-escalate the situation and get people talking even while highlighting the huge challenges involved.
One thing that keeps coming up is the potential role of the international community in mediating a solution. Several sources talk about the need for strong diplomatic pressure on both sides to come to the negotiating table and explore compromises.
Right, and I'm curious about what that diplomatic pressure would actually look like. Are we talking about sanctions, economic incentives, or something else entirely?
It could be a mix of things. The sources suggest a multi-pronged approach using both carrots and sticks. So tightening economic sanctions on Russia, but at the same time offering financial aid and reconstruction support to Ukraine if they're willing to negotiate.
That makes sense. Using a combination of pressure and incentives to try to push both sides towards a resolution. But as we've discussed, there's a lot of distrust in Kyiv about whether Russia would negotiate in good faith. Those broken ceasefires in the past make it hard to trust anything coming from Moscow.
I understand that. And that's where credible third-party mediators become even more important. Several sources suggest that countries or organizations known for their neutrality and their diplomatic skills could be key in getting the two sides talking and building trust.
Are there any specific countries or organizations that come to mind?
Some sources mention countries like Switzerland or Austria. They have a long history of neutrality and a reputation for being good at diplomacy. International organizations like the United Nations or the OSCE could also play a role.
Interesting. And one source that talks about the global implications of the war even suggests that this conflict could lead to a new international framework or agreement, something that addresses the underlying security concerns that caused the war in the first place.
It's a big idea, but not impossible. History shows that even the most difficult conflicts can sometimes lead to unexpected diplomatic breakthroughs. And those breakthroughs often happen when both sides realize that continuing to fight will cost them more than anything they could possibly gain.
So even though the path to peace is long and difficult, it's not completely blocked.
Yeah.
But even if they do reach a negotiated settlement, the scars of this war are going to run deep. The impact on Ukraine, on the region, on the global order is going to be long-lasting.
Absolutely. The sources don't sugarcoat the long-term consequences of this conflict, even in the best-case scenario where they do reach a peace agreement. One of the most concerning aspects is the demographic impact. Kimmett points out that Ukraine's population is shrinking because of casualties and because so many people have fled the country. Rebuilding the country, both physically and socially, is going to be a monumental task.
It's hard to even imagine how big that rebuilding effort will be. And the economic consequences are going to be felt for years. The war has already disrupted global supply chains, caused inflation, led to energy shortages, especially in Europe. The sources suggest that the economic fallout is going to be widespread and long-lasting.
Exactly. And then there's the psychological toll of the war, the trauma and the grief that will linger long after the fighting is over. The source that focuses on the soldiers in Kursk gives us a glimpse into the mental and emotional burden they're carrying. And those wounds are going to take time and care to heal.
It's a reminder that the true cost of war goes way beyond the battlefield. It affects every part of society and leaves behind a legacy of pain, loss, and uncertainty.
It really does. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with a sense of urgency, but also a lot of uncertainty. We need peace, but the way to get there is still unclear. And even if we do find a way to end the fighting, the world is going to be dealing with the consequences of this war for generations.
It's a lot to take in. So where do we go from here? What can we as individuals do when faced with such a complex and overwhelming situation?
I think the most important thing is to stay engaged. We can't afford to become complacent or indifferent. We need to stay informed, to think critically about the information we're getting, and to have thoughtful conversations about possible solutions. We also have a responsibility to support humanitarian efforts to help the people who are suffering because of this conflict.
I couldn't agree more. It's easy to feel helpless when you look at the scale of this problem, but even small actions can make a difference. Whether it's donating to aid organizations, speaking up for peace, or just having informed conversations with people around us, we all have a role to play in creating a more peaceful future.
Exactly. This deep dive has been a sobering experience, but it's been necessary. We've explored the complexities of this war, we've seen its devastating consequences, and we've thought about ways to move forward. But in the end, the future is still uncertain. It's up to all of us to work towards a resolution that puts peace, justice, and human dignity first.
Thank you for guiding us through this difficult and complex topic. It's been really eye-opening. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep seeking out different perspectives. Think critically and demand better from our leaders. The pursuit of peace is something we all have to work towards together.